Judging, however, is also to be looked at as a positive act of thought and has a positive content. Through this aspect, the contradiction present in the apprehending consciousness and its identity with the first consciousness becomes still more complete. The consciousness that acts declares its specific action to be a duty, and the consciousness that judges it cannot deny this. For duty itself is the form which lacks all content, but is capable of any. In other words, the concrete action, which in its many-sidedness is in its own self diverse, contains the universal aspect, that which is taken as duty, just as much as the particular aspect, which constitutes the share and interest of the individual in the action. Now, the judging consciousness does not stop short at the former aspect of duty, at the doer's knowledge of it, that this is his duty, and at the fact that the doer knows it to be his duty, the condition and status of his reality. On the contrary, it holds to the other aspect, looks at what the action is in itself, and explains it as resulting from an intention different from the action itself and from selfish motives. Just as every action is capable of being looked at from the point of view of conformity to duty, so too can it be considered from the point of view of the particularity of the doer. For qua action, it is the actuality of the individual. This judging of the action thus takes it out of its outer existence and reflects it into its inner aspect or into the form of its own particularity. If the action is accompanied by fame, then it knows this inner aspect to be a desire for fame. If it is altogether in keeping with the station of the individual without going beyond this station, and of such a nature that the individuality does not possess its station as a character externally attached to it, but through its own self gives filling to this universality, thereby showing itself capable of a higher station, then the inner aspect of the action is judged to be ambition, and so on. Since, in the action as such, the doer attains to a vision of himself in objectivity, or to a feeling of self in his existence, and thus to enjoyment, the inner aspect is judged to be an urge to secure his own happiness, even though this were to consist merely in an inner moral conceit, in the enjoyment of being conscious of his own superiority, and in the foretaste of a hope of future happiness. No action can escape such judgment. For duty's sake, this pure purpose is an unreality. It becomes a reality in the deed of an individuality, and the action is thereby charged with the aspect of particularity. No man is a hero to his valet. Not, however, because the man is not a hero, but because the valet is a valet, whose dealings are with the man, not as a hero, but as one who eats, drinks, and wears clothes. In general, with his individual wants and fancies. Thus, for the judging consciousness, there is no action in which it could not oppose to the universal aspect of the action, the personal aspect of the individuality, and play the part of the moral valet towards the agent. There are a number of famous quips, little quotes and passages in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And here in paragraph 665, we get one of them towards the end. Some of you may recognize this. No man is a hero to his valet. And it continues. We'll look at what he says there. But I've rephrased it slightly so that it's a little bit more gender inclusive. Why should men be the only people to be, demythologized or unmasked in this way by those who serve them? Why not everybody? No one is a hero to their valet. In German, es gibt keinen Helden für den Kammerdiener. So the Kammerdiener is somebody who serves a person in rather intimate ways. Hegel at the end talks about this person seeing the hero, the dealings with the person, not as a hero, but one who eats, drinks, and wears clothes. And he's actually being a little bit delicate in this way, or decorous, because they're also the one who empties the chamber pot. They're also the one who, witnesses the coming home late and flopping down in bed and then taking off their clothes after the dance of this person. Or they're the one who has to shine the muddy boots after cleaning them. We could go on and on and on. They're the one who sees the person behaving in ways that are not heroic. And we'll come back to this in a moment, this intimacy that this affords. Who is the valet in this case? Well, it's the apprehending consciousness, the universal consciousness that we saw doesn't act but engages in judgment. Judgment of what? Of the other, the acting consciousness. And in this entire long section, we have a really interesting examination of how actions and the actors, those who are engaging in the actions, can be interpreted. Now, Hegel is not putting this forth as like his general theory of action at this point any more than he was in previous paragraphs, particularly in the reason and the spirit section, where we've looked at action in a number of different ways, particularly here in this morality section. But what we can say is that Hegel is showing us a very general way in which actions do get interpreted by those who themselves are not necessarily engaging in the action but looking at it from the outside. It could also be internalized, as he's held out, right? The acting consciousness does have these two sides of the individual acting consciousness, the universal within them, which could be judging them from within as well. You might say that every one of us, insofar as we are a hero acting, we contain our own valet, we contain our own chamber servant, right? So let's look at what he has to say here. This is a very, very interesting and important paragraph. He says, judging is also to be looked at as a positive act of thought and has a positive content. Now that's rather promising, isn't it? And he's not going to realize that promise here in that paragraph. Where we expect him to go immediately after that is to say, oh, the judging, the thinking, the apprehending consciousness, thinking is also an action. It is also handeln. He doesn't do that. That's not where this is actually going. It is going to advance the dialectic, as we see. He tells us, through this aspect, the contradiction present in the apprehending consciousness, in the thinking, the universal consciousness, and its identity with the first consciousness, the one who's individuated and acting, becomes still more complete. So how does it become more complete? There is an action going on here, an action of advancing, as I just said, the dialectic through thinking out what is actually going on and then taking it on as one's own condition as well. And so we can look at this in two different ways. We can look at what the movement is as it's being sketched out by Hegel here. We can also view this as what apprehending consciousness at this point would be applying to itself and as something that we ourselves could take on and think about how we understand our own motives. And I'll say one thing before we dive into this. So the valet interprets motives as self-centered, as coming out of one's own natural being. The hero is a hero, but is not a hero to the valet, precisely because of the perspective the valet has, which is a real perspective. The hero does eat, get dressed, goes to the bathroom, scrubs themselves of their sweat and, tries to eliminate their body odor by all sorts of perfumes or oils or carrying around little sticks or things like that, burps, does all these things that make them seemingly less heroic, right? And the camera, there isn't a camera to cut away and not look at that stuff, or editing to, mute out those sounds, the sniffing that might be happening or whatever else is going on. The valet sees the reality of the person. And insofar as you are looking at yourself through the eyes of the valet, you are understanding yourself in that way as this body that's, moving around and doing whatever it does. And you can understand your own actions as not necessarily motivated solely by, as he says, duty for duty's sake. But there's more going on in the picture here. So anyway, he goes on and he says, the consciousness that acts declares its specific action. And so here the specific action tun, right? Most of the time he's using the word handeln, behavior. Here he's considering a specific action, bestimmtes, determined, some sort of action that they have decided upon. You can think of action in this sense as like considering the options in front of you and zeroing in. That would be another way to talk about it. And it declares this to be duty, to be what it ought to do, to be in accordance with duty, Pflicht, right? Moral obligation. And he goes on and he says, the consciousness that judges, it cannot deny this. Why not? Why can't the consciousness that judges say, you're being a hypocrite, like it did earlier, you're not really doing your duty? Well, because duty is something that is universal and therefore is a form that can be filled in by whatever content we want. He says duty is the form that lacks all content but is capable of any. And who decides what the content is going to be? The person who's actually acting, the acting consciousness, the one who does, who decides, who commits, who acts within the world. So he says, in other words, the concrete action, and now here he uses the word handel, not just tat, which in its many-sidedness is in its own self diverse, contains the universal aspect. Now that's interesting. So action is many-sided, right? It can be looked at in multiple ways. It can apply itself to multiple things. It's also many-sided in that there's multiple components to action. There is, in fact, motives, intention, conditions, all these things that we saw as we were looking at actions earlier on in the morality section and also in earlier parts of reason and spirit. So action is really something, when it's concrete, it is really something quite complex, quite many-sided. And the universal consciousness has to recognize a certain kind of universality there in action, the action of the person, the individual. So he says, it contains the universal aspect, that which is taken as duty, just as much as the particular aspect which constitutes the share and interest of the individual in the action. So you never get one without the other. If you want somebody to act in a certain way, you do have to also take into account who they are, their circumstances, the circumstances in which you want them to act, their own background, their own intentions, their motives, their, we could go on, dispositions, their relationships with others. We can get very, very complicated with this, can't we? So these are both sides to the acting person, and now we've got a certain kind of universality here. So here's where it gets really interesting. So the judging consciousness does not stop short at the former aspect of duty, at the doer's knowledge of it, that it is his duty, and at the fact that the doer knows it to be his duty, the condition and status of his reality. So the acting consciousness doesn't just declare things to be their duty and then do them. They know things to be their duty. They go through a reasoning process sometimes, or they rely upon their training, or they consult their conscience, or whatever it is. They have knowledge that something is what they ought to do, their moral obligation, and then either they do it or they don't do it, or maybe they half-ass it and do it part way and don't persevere. There's all sorts of possibilities. In this case, we have a acting consciousness that does it, right? And then we have the apprehending consciousness. And the apprehending consciousness gets what the acting consciousness is saying about what it's doing, but it doesn't entirely buy it. Instead, the apprehending consciousness, at least in its own view, sees more. It posits more, right? So it says, on the contrary, it holds to the other aspect, looks at what the action is in itself. So this could be done in a lot of different ways. I'm sure for some readers, this makes you think about, Kant and, determining what the maxim of one's action is. And what Kant does in talking about that is not something really radical or something new. Thomas Aquinas called this determining the moral species of an action, right? In the 20th century, we would call this, in moral philosophy, the proper description of the action. And if you look backwards, you see a lot of people discussing this in a lot of different ways. How do we make sense out of what the action is as such? And Hegel goes on and says, they explain it as resulting from something else. So this is where we might think for a minute. So when we decide on actions, how does that actually work? We have a particular thing that we think is our duty or what we ought to do, and then we will to do it, right? Well, what gets us to will to do it? In some respects, the will is self-determining, and that always scares people because that makes it arbitrary, or in German, willkürlich, right? Like a will, in some respects. But the will, it doesn't just decide out of a vacuum. It has intentions. Absicht, right, in German. What you have in mind to accomplish with the action. Before you do the action, you have an intention, and then you do it. And what motivates intentions? Well, motives, right? Motivations. And we can talk about one's motivational structure and how that interconnects with and helps to motivate the will. The will can, by the way, work on itself, in at least by the perspective of some moral philosophers, and say, I want to reject this motive, I want to amplify this other motive. But the will is motivated by motives. And so the acting person has something in the background. And the question is, well, where does this come from? And how aware are we of these? So the apprehending consciousness, the one who's engaging in judgment, says it looks at the action and explains that it is resulting from an intention different from the action itself and from selfish motives. Eigennützigen Triebfeder, right? Triebfeder, sorry. So things that are essentially self-centered or coming out of the self that one is. Not coming from some duty for duty's sake, which he's going to decry in just a little bit. He says, just as every action is capable of being looked at from the point of view of conformity to duty, it can also be considered from the point of view of the particularity of the doer. Why? Because as an action, as something that is real, happening in the world, or even happening within one's body or one's consciousness, it is the actuality of the individual. You can't do actions in general. You have to actually do an action. If I want to scratch my face with a finger because I've got an itch, I can't just have finger in general doing the scratching, or else I'm going to keep itching, right? I got to pick, is it going to be this finger? Or maybe my thumb, or I'll reach around, and it'll be this index finger on the other hand, because I'm like a virtuoso of scratching my face, or some silliness like that, right? You can apply this to anything. And this, by the way, is something that Hegel makes as a general point in other places. Like he's talking about, the silliness of desiring fruit and passing up every single fruit that's offered to you. No, I don't want apples, don't want oranges, don't want this, don't want that. You got to pick a fruit. An action has to happen by somebody actually, wirklich, doing the action. So now that raises a problem. The actor, who's a particular, has particular motives. Now here's where it starts to get kind of funny, right? And here's where we can say, are we really sure that the apprehending consciousness is getting things right? Hegel's not worried about that. He's being, a good phenomenologist, following along, seeing what this apprehending consciousness is up to. And so it looks at the person's actions. And here we go through a couple examples. We could multiply these examples manifold. Maybe I'll come up with a few after we look at Hegel's. So he says, this judging of the action takes it out of its outer existence, what we can see, and reflects it into its inner aspect, into the form of its own particularity. What we're saying is this is what's really going on in the person's mind or heart. If the action is accompanied by fame, then it, the judging consciousness, knows this inner aspect to be a desire for fame. So if you wind up being famous, that must be what you were aiming at, right? If it gets you people opening doors for you and giving you candy and shoving microphones in your face, that must be what you were aiming at the whole time. That was your intention coming out of this motive, and you're calling what you're doing duty, but it's not really duty. It's really being famous, right? So if you were, for example, here's one close to myself, if you were creating YouTube videos because you found that you had a facility with explaining certain concepts from texts and thinkers, and they turned out to be helpful for people, and they got shared, and you got subscribers and views. That was what you were after in the first place. So this is a little bit arbitrary, isn't it? How do you know it was that and not making a ton of money? Well, because you don't make a ton of money on YouTube unless you're doing cat videos or makeup tutorials or stuff like that. But how do you know it wasn't this other thing or this other thing or this other thing? The apprehending consciousness is positing this. Let's look at the next example, which is even more interesting. It's a little bit more convoluted. If it is altogether, that is the action, in keeping with the station of the individual, their job, their rank, their position, we would say, without going beyond this station, so you're staying within your job description, and of such a nature that the individuality does not possess its station as a character externally attached to it, but through its own self gives filling to this universality, thereby showing itself as capable of a higher station. So, how do we translate that into more contemporary terms? You're on the job, you have been assigned some tasks, you're fulfilling them well, and you're not just doing so because somebody is making you do it. You are throwing yourself into your work, as we say. Well, then that shows that you're capable of better things. So management takes notice of you, and they're like, oh, we got to promote this person. We're going to give them a higher station. And it works this way in hierarchical organizations, doesn't it? I mean, there's a little bit of a side note. If you've never read the book, The Peter Principle, read it. Because it's about hierarchical organized structures like the military, the church, academia, where people can move up by doing their job well at the position that they're at. And then somebody says, oh, well, they deserve a promotion. And sooner or later, everybody gets promoted to a position where they're no longer capable of handling the duties of that, and they start screwing up, and then they don't get promoted anymore. Well, this is Peter saw this as sort of a universal dynamic. It may not be that, but something like that is being imputed here by the apprehending consciousness, isn't it? It says, it shows itself, the inner aspect of the action is judged to be ambition for higher position. So, you do a good job as a dog catcher, well, maybe we should vote you in as a city councilor. You do a good job as a city councilor, maybe you should be exploring becoming a mayor. And then, after that, maybe governor, or after governor, then president, right? And so on and so forth. And people might do this getting outside of their lane as well. Oh, you're a great lawyer, you should be the president. Maybe not. Anyway, he gives these as examples, and he says that since the action as such, The doer attains to a vision of himself in objectivity or to a feeling of self in his existence, thus to enjoyment. The inner aspect is judged to be an urge to secure his own happiness. So what we're seeing here, these are the motivators, right? A vision, an Anschauung, intuition, of oneself in objectivity, getting an objective viewpoint of oneself, being able to see oneself as an object, a Gegenstand, right? Being able to look at oneself and say, I'm the kind of person who does this sort of thing. Feeling of oneself, Selbstgefühl, in one's existence, in Dasein, feeling of oneself in one's existence, and thereby enjoyment, Genuss, right? These are all oriented by this urge to secure one's own happiness, in German Trieb, a drive to nach eigener Glückseligkeit. Glückseligkeit, happiness, literally like eudaimonia kind of happiness, or the more psychological happiness. Eigener, one's own happiness. Your intention is not the same thing as duty. Your intention is to make yourself happy by saying, oh, what a great guy I am. I'm the person who pursues duty. And look at the next thing he says right after this, right? Even though this were merely to consist in inner moral conceit in the enjoyment of being conscious of one's own superiority and the foretaste of the hope of future happiness. And then Hegel goes on and he says, no action can escape such judgment. For duty's sake, this pure purpose is an unreality. It just doesn't exist. People behave the way that they do because they're going to get something out of it. And it's motivated, and they have intentions that are like that. Here's where we get to, it says it becomes an unreality in the deed of an individuality. The action is thereby charged with the aspect of particularity. Here's where we get the famous line, no man is a hero to his valet. And now we need to fill in the gaps. Because if we stop short there, we'd have this universal cynicism. Nobody's a hero to their valet. Everybody's kind of crap when you get down to it. You just got to hang out with them for a little while, and you see what garbage human beings are. That's not what Hegel's saying. No man is a hero to their valet. Why? Because the valet, he says, not because the man is not a hero, but because the valet is a valet, whose dealings are with the man not as a hero, but one who eats, drinks, wears clothes, in general with individual wants and fancies. So this is an interesting psychological observation, maybe a sociological observation. Then he's applying it to how the apprehending consciousness looks at actions done by specific people. And this could also be what the acting consciousness internalizes and says about its own actions. Oh, I'm not really that good. I'm just doing, the things that I do to satisfy myself. So he says, for the judging consciousness, there is no action in which it could not oppose to the universal aspect of the action, the personal aspect of the individuality, and play the part of the moral valet towards the agent. So this is why the whole hero-valet thing is coming in here. It's because that is what the apprehending consciousness is doing in relation to the acting consciousness. It is behaving like a valet. It's attributing these kind of selfish base motives to the person who's acting and saying this is what's really driving them, not their knowledge, not the duty itself, not the necessity of acting, not anything particularly good in their character. It's unable to see the hero side of it, which implies that maybe there is, at least in some cases, still a hero side there in the background or in the acting consciousness.